Dinner was supposed to be harmless, just another evening where we pretended everything was normal. We were seated around the table, plates half full, polite smiles carefully rehearsed. My parents were chatting like always, too calm, too perfect. Then my grandpa looked straight at me and asked, almost casually, "That fund I gave your parents helped, didn't it?" The room went silent. I felt my chest tighten. "What fund, Grandpa?" I said. "We never received anything." His expression changed instantly. The warmth drained from his face, replaced by something cold and alert. Across the table, my mother's fork slipped from her hand. My father stopped breathing for a second too long. No one spoke. No one laughed it off. And in that frozen moment, I realized something was deeply wrong. Because the way my parents avoided my eyes told me this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a secret. One that had been buried for years until that dinner exposed everything. Growing up, people always said I was lucky. "Your parents are so responsible. You come from such a stable family. You don't know how good you have it, Camila." I heard those words so often that I started repeating them to myself, even when something inside me felt wrong. On the outside, my family looked perfect, a quiet suburban home. Two parents who never raised their voices in public, and dinners that followed the same routine every night. Nothing dramatic, nothing obviously broken, but stability can be a performance. My parents believed deeply in appearances. We didn't argue at the table. We didn't discuss money. We didn't question decisions. When I was younger, I thought that meant we were close. Now I know it meant something else. Silence was expected, and obedience was praised. Whenever I asked for something, new shoes, school trips, even help with college applications, the answer was always the same. "We're doing our best. You'll understand when you're older. You need to learn to be independent." Independence became their favorite word. They used it like a shield, a way to justify every closed door. By the time I was 18, I was already working part-time jobs, juggling classes, rent, and bills. I told myself it was normal. Lots of people struggled. That didn't mean my parents had failed me. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. My grandfather, on the other hand, was different. He lived 2 states away and visited only a few times a year, but when he did, the house felt warmer. He listened when I spoke. He asked questions my parents never did about my dreams, my stress, my plans for the future. He had this quiet way of making you feel seen, like your life actually mattered. When I was 16, he once said something that stayed with me. "Your education is important, Camila," he told me. "Your future shouldn't be a burden." At the time, I didn't think much of it. Adults said things like that all the time. Encouraging words, nothing more. And my parents were sitting right there, nodding, smiling, agreeing with him. I had no reason to doubt them, or so I thought. As the years passed, the gap between what my parents said and how I lived kept growing. They insisted money was tight, yet they never missed vacations. They warned me about being irresponsible, yet they made big decisions without ever explaining them. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, I blamed myself for not working hard enough. That night at dinner, I walked in carrying all of that weight without realizing it. I thought I was just tired, stressed, overthinking. I didn't know I was about to learn that my struggle wasn't an accident. It was a choice someone else had made for me. And once my grandfather asked that question, there was no way to pretend anymore. By the time I turned 22, exhaustion had become my normal state. I woke up before sunrise, worked a morning shift at a cafe, rushed to classes, then headed straight to my second job in the evening. Some nights, I studied until my vision blurred. Other nights, I fell asleep still wearing my shoes. I told myself this was what independence looked like. This was what adults did. Whenever my parents called, they asked the same questions. "Are you being responsible? You're not wasting money, are you? You know we can't help you forever." I learned how to answer them carefully. I never mentioned the skipped meals or the overdue bills. I never admitted how close I was to breaking down. Because every time I hinted that I was struggling, my mother's tone hardened. "We raised you to be strong, Camila. Complaining won't solve anything. You should be grateful you even have opportunities." Grateful, that word again. It followed me everywhere, sitting heavy on my chest. I felt guilty for wanting more, guilty for feeling tired, guilty for wishing my life was easier than it was. So I swallowed my doubts and kept going. But the questions didn't disappear. They waited. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about small moments that never made sense. How my parents always changed the subject when money came up. How they insisted I apply only to local colleges. How they discouraged internships that didn't pay well, even if they helped my career. "It's not practical," my father would say. "Dreams don't pay rent." I believed him. I didn't think I had a choice. Still, there were things I couldn't explain. My parents complained about expenses constantly, yet their lifestyle never shrank. New furniture appeared. Renovations happened. Vacations were booked without hesitation. When I asked how they managed it, my mother smiled tightly. "Budgeting," she said. "Something you should learn." The first real crack appeared during a phone call with my grandfather. He asked how school was going, and for once, I didn't lie. I told him I was tired, that I was overwhelmed, that I was worried about how I'd afford the next semester. There was a pause on the line. "That's strange," he said slowly. "I thought that would have been taken care of." I laughed it off. "No, Grandpa, I've got it handled." But after we hung up, his words stayed with me. Taken care of. I replayed that conversation for weeks, trying to convince myself I had misunderstood. Maybe he meant emotionally. Maybe he was just being supportive. Still, the unease grew. When I mentioned the call to my parents, the reaction was immediate. My mother's face tightened. "Your grandfather worries too much." "I have furted in," my father added. "He doesn't know how things really work anymore." That was the end of the conversation. They didn't ask what he had said. They didn't ask how I felt. And that was when I started to understand something important. The problem wasn't just that I was struggling. It was that no one wanted me to ask why. By the time that family dinner was planned, I was already carrying quiet suspicions I didn't have the courage to voice. I told myself I was being paranoid, that families didn't hide things like that from their own children. I had no idea how wrong I was. Because all it took was one question at that table to turn those quiet doubts into a truth I could no longer escape. The dinner was my mother's idea. She said it casually, like it was nothing special. "Your grandparents are in town. We should all eat together." Her voice was light, rehearsed, as if this gathering had no weight at all. I didn't argue. I rarely did. When I arrived at my parents' house that evening, everything looked perfect. Too perfect. The table was set with the good plates, the ones we only used on holidays. Candles were lit, though it wasn't a special occasion. The air smelled of roasted meat and herbs, warm and comforting, like a memory that had been carefully staged. My father greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Long day?" he asked. "Always," I said, forcing a laugh. My mother adjusted a napkin, straightened a chair, smoothed invisible wrinkles from the tablecloth. She was nervous. I could tell by the way her hands never stayed still. Then my grandparents arrived. My grandfather hugged me a little longer than usual. "You look tired, sweetheart," he said softly. "Are you eating enough?" Before I could answer, my mother stepped in. "She works too much. We've told her to slow down." I bit my tongue. "You've told me to be independent," I thought. But I stayed quiet. We sat down to eat, and for the first few minutes, everything followed the familiar script. Small talk about the weather. Complaints about traffic. My father joked about work. My mother laughed a little too loudly at everything my grandfather said. I watched them closely, noticing details I'd ignored before. How my parents kept exchanging quick glances. How my mother's smile tightened whenever my grandfather looked at me for too long. How my father avoided certain topics entirely. "So, Camila," my grandmother asked, "how's school going?" I started to answer, but my mother interrupted. "She's managing," she said quickly. "She's always been good at handling things on her own." There it was again. Independence. My grandfather frowned slightly. "That's good," he said, then looked at me. "But it's not easy. Especially these days." I nodded, grateful for his understanding. "It's been challenging," I admitted. My mother cleared her throat. "Everyone struggles at that age." Something in her tone felt sharp, almost defensive. As dinner went on, the tension thickened. It wasn't loud or obvious. It sat between us, heavy and unspoken, like a secret everyone knew not to touch. I felt like I was walking through a room filled with invisible wires. One wrong step and everything would snap. Halfway through the meal, my grandfather set his fork down. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone. He just looked at me with genuine concern. "Camila," he said, "that fund I gave your parents helped, didn't it?" The words landed softly, but the effect was immediate. My chest tightened. My heart started pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. I searched his face, waiting for a hint that he was joking, that I had misheard him. My voice caught. "What fund, Grandpa?" My parents froze. My mother's fork slipped from her fingers and clattered against the plate. My father stared down at the table, his jaw clenched, his knuckles turning white. "We never received anything," I said slowly. "I've been paying for everything myself." The silence that followed was unbearable. My grandfather didn't speak right away. He looked from me to my parents, his expression shifting from confusion to something much darker, something alert. "This isn't funny," he said quietly. No one laughed, and in that moment I knew. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the beginning of a truth my parents had never intended me to hear. No one moved. The air felt heavy, like it had thickened around us. I could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the ticking of the clock on the wall, sounds that suddenly felt too loud, too intrusive. My grandfather looked at my parents again, slower this time. His eyes narrowed, not in anger yet, but in disbelief. "You mean to tell me," he said carefully, "that Camila never received any of the money?" My mother was the first to speak. She laughed once. It was short and sharp, completely out of place. "Dad, you're confused," she said. "There's no reason to upset her over something like that." Something like that. My stomach twisted. "I'm not upset," I said quietly. "I'm just trying to understand." My father finally lifted his head. "This isn't the time for this conversation," he said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge underneath it. "We're having dinner." My grandfather ignored him. "I remember very clearly," he said, his voice firm now, "setting aside money for Camila's education. Not once, not twice, over several years." He turned to me. "I was told it would ease your burden." I felt dizzy. Ease my burden. I thought of all the nights I'd gone to bed hungry, all the shifts I'd picked up instead of sleeping, all the opportunities I'd turned down because I couldn't afford them. My mother's smile cracked. "You're exaggerating," she said. "Things weren't that simple." My grandmother spoke for the first time. "Then explain it," she said softly, "because this doesn't sound like a misunderstanding." My father pushed his chair back slightly. "We did what we thought was best," he said. "That money went toward family needs." "Family needs?" I repeated. My voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. "You told me there was no money." My mother's eyes finally met mine, and for a split second I saw it panic. "We raised you," she said quickly. "We kept a roof over your head." "Do you think that was free?" The words hit harder than I expected. "So that money was never meant for me?" I asked. "That's not what we're saying," my father replied. "You're twisting this." My grandfather stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, making everyone flinch. He placed both hands on the table, leaning forward. "I trusted you," he said to my parents. "That money was not a gift for your household. It was for her future." No one interrupted him. "You told me she was taken care of," he continued, "that she was focusing on her studies, that she didn't need to worry." My throat tightened. "I've been worrying every day," I said. "You just didn't know." My mother shook her head, her voice rising. "This is unfair. You're turning her against us." "No," my grandfather said sharply. "You did that yourselves." The room felt smaller with every word. I looked at my parents, really looked at them, and saw strangers. People who had watched me struggle and decided it was necessary. Acceptable. Character building. "You let me believe I wasn't worth the help," I said. "You let me think this was all my fault." My father's jaw clenched. "You're being dramatic." That was the moment something inside me snapped, not loudly, not violently, but completely. "I trusted you," I said, my voice shaking. "I defended you. Every time someone asked why I was struggling, I made excuses for you." My grandfather straightened. "This isn't over," he said calmly. "Not tonight." My mother opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in my life, she had nothing to say. The truth hadn't fully come out yet, but the silence around that table had already confessed enough. And I knew whatever happened next, my life would never go back to the way it was before that dinner. No one sat down again. My grandfather remained standing, his hands still resting on the table as if he needed the support. My parents stayed frozen in their chairs, caught between defending themselves and realizing there was nowhere left to run. I felt strangely calm. Not peaceful, just empty. Like something inside me had burned out, leaving only clarity behind. "How much?" my grandfather asked. My father blinked. "What? How much money did you take?" His voice was steady, controlled. That scared me more than if he had shouted. My mother let out a sharp breath. "This is getting out of hand." "No," my grandfather replied. "It's finally getting honest." I looked at my parents, waiting. My heart pounded, but I didn't interrupt. I wanted to hear them say it. I needed to. My father rubbed his temples. "It wasn't like that," he said. "The money came in gradually. We had expenses. The house needed repairs, medical bills, life happens. So you used it," I said. He didn't answer. "That fund," my grandfather continued, "was meant to protect her, to make sure she didn't have to sacrifice her future just to survive." My mother stood up suddenly. "You're acting like we stole from her," she snapped. "We did everything for this family." I laughed. It surprised everyone, including me. "You did everything," I repeated. "Except tell me the truth." My voice was shaking now, the calm finally cracking. "Do you have any idea what it feels like to work yourself to exhaustion while believing you're the problem? To think you're failing because you're not strong enough?" My mother looked away. "You watched me struggle," I said. "You listened to me apologize for needing help." My father's voice hardened. "We wanted you to build character. By lying to me?" I shot back. "By letting me believe I wasn't worth investing in?" My grandfather exhaled slowly. "You told me she was grateful," he said. "That she understood sacrifices had to be made." I swallowed. "I was grateful," I said quietly. "Because you trained me to be." The room went silent again. My grandmother reached for my hand. Her grip was warm, grounding. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "this was never your fault." Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I had cried alone too many times already. My father finally spoke the words I think he'd been avoiding all night. "We didn't think she needed to know." There it was. "You didn't think I needed to know about my own future," I said. "About money that was meant for me." My mother crossed her arms defensively. "We are her parents." "And I am your daughter," I replied. "Not your asset, not your backup plan." My grandfather straightened. "Did you keep records?" he asked. My parents exchanged a glance. That was answer enough. "This wasn't mismanagement," he said firmly. "This was deception." My mother's voice rose. "Are you threatening us now?" "I'm protecting her," he replied. "Something you failed to do." I felt my chest tighten. "All those times you told me there was nothing left," I said. "All those nights I skipped meals because I didn't want to ask for more. You knew." My father's voice dropped. "You're exaggerating." "No," I said. "I'm remembering." The truth came rushing back all at once, the internships I turned down, the classes I couldn't afford, the opportunities I thought were out of reach because I believed the money simply didn't exist. "You didn't just take money," I said. "You took choices." My mother's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel victory. I felt grief for the version of myself that trusted them without question. My grandfather spoke again, calm and unyielding. "We will discuss next steps with professionals," he said. "There will be accountability." "You'd take this outside the family?" my father asked sharply. "This stopped being a family matter when you decided to hide it from her," my grandfather replied. I took a deep breath. "I'm done being quiet," I said. "I'm done protecting your image at the cost of my well-being." My parents stared at me as if they were seeing me for the first time. Maybe they were. The power had shifted. Not dramatically, not violently, but completely. And as painful as that moment was, one truth stood above everything else. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't weak. And I wasn't wrong for asking questions. The truth had finally come out, and it was never going back in. That night didn't end with shouting. It ended with something far more unsettling: clarity. After the truth came out, no one rushed to clean the table. No one pretended everything was fine. My parents sat stiffly, as if the weight of their choices had finally settled on their shoulders. For the first time, they weren't in control of the narrative. My grandfather was the one who spoke first. "We're not handling this emotionally," he said. "We're handling it properly." My mother scoffed. "You're overreacting." "No," he replied calmly. "I've reacted too late." He turned to me. "Camila, you don't owe anyone silence. What happened here isn't just a family disagreement. It involves responsibility." That word responsibility felt different coming from him. It wasn't a weapon, it was a safeguard. My father tried to regain control. "We can talk about this privately," he said. "There's no need to involve outsiders." "There is," my grandfather answered, "because secrecy is how this happened." I felt my hands shaking slightly, but my voice stayed steady. "I don't want revenge," I said. "I want transparency, and I want protection." The room went quiet again. My grandmother nodded. "You have every right to that." What followed wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive. My grandfather explained clearly, patiently, that funds set aside for a specific purpose came with obligations. That using them without disclosure, especially when they affected my education and future, crossed a serious line. He didn't accuse, he didn't threaten, he outlined facts. "This will be reviewed," he said, "with documentation, with professionals who understand these matters." My mother stood up, pacing. "So now she's turning us into criminals?" "No," my grandfather said. "Your actions did that on their own." I felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Fear of what would come next. Relief that I wasn't alone anymore. My father looked at me then, not with authority, but with something closer to uncertainty. "What do you want?" he asked. The question stunned me. For so long, no one had asked. "I want to finish my education without constantly being afraid," I said. "I want access to information about my own life. And I want clear boundaries." "Boundaries?" my mother repeated bitterly. "Yes," I said. "No more decisions made about me without me. No more secrets." My grandfather nodded approvingly. "That's reasonable." That word reasonable was everything. We didn't resolve everything that night. There were no final numbers, no signed papers, but there was a shift. A line drawn. Before leaving, my grandfather pulled me aside. "This may get uncomfortable," he said gently, "but discomfort is temporary. What you were living with before, that wasn't." I nodded, swallowing hard. I was scared to speak up. "I know," he said. "That's why it mattered that you did." When I walked out of that house, the air felt different. Lighter. Not because things were fixed, but because they were finally honest. Over the next few weeks, things moved slowly but deliberately. Conversations happened with advisors. Records were requested. For the first time, I was included in discussions about my own future. My parents didn't apologize, not fully, but they stopped pretending. And I stopped carrying their silence. What stayed with me most wasn't anger. It was the realization that control often hides behind words like care and discipline. That questioning doesn't make you ungrateful, it makes you informed. I wasn't breaking my family apart. I was stepping out of a system that had kept me small. And, for the first time, I felt protected, not because someone decided for me, but because the truth was finally on my side. The hardest part came after the confrontation. Not the paperwork, not the conversations with advisors. The silence. For years, my life had been shaped by pressure, by constant expectations, unspoken rules, and the quiet fear of stepping out of line. When that pressure suddenly lifted, I didn't feel free right away. I felt lost. Some mornings, I woke up expecting my phone to buzz with another message, reminding me to be responsible. Another warning about money. Another lecture disguised as concern. When it didn't come, I lay there, unsure of what to do with the calm. My grandparents checked in often, but they never hovered. They didn't try to control the process. They listened. They asked what I wanted. That alone felt revolutionary. With proper guidance, my education became manageable again. I adjusted my schedule. I dropped the second job. I slept, really slept for the first time in years. It amazed me how much clearer my mind felt when survival was no longer my only goal. My parents and I barely spoke. When we did, the conversations were careful, guarded. There were no dramatic apologies, no emotional speeches, just an unspoken understanding that things had changed permanently. They no longer dictated my choices, and I no longer explained myself. That distance hurt, but it also healed. I started noticing how deeply their control had shaped me, how often I apologized for taking up space, how uncomfortable I felt asking for help, even when it was offered freely. Healing, I learned, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about unlearning it. One afternoon, as I sat with my grandfather on a park bench near campus, he asked me something simple. "What do you want now?" The question stopped me. I had spent so many years reacting, surviving, adjusting that I had never allowed myself to imagine a future without fear attached to it. "I want choices," I said finally. "Real ones." He smiled. "Then you're already on the right path." Slowly, I began to build a life that felt like mine. I chose classes because they excited me, not because they were practical enough. I accepted opportunities without immediately calculating what I would have to sacrifice to afford them. I learned to say no without guilt. Most importantly, I stopped blaming myself for what had happened. I wasn't naive. I wasn't weak. I was trusting. And trust should never be punished. The night of that dinner no longer replayed in my head with the same intensity. Instead of shame, it carried clarity. It reminded me that speaking up had changed everything. Not overnight, not easily, but permanently. I didn't lose my family. I lost the version of it that depended on my silence. And in its place, I found something stronger than approval. I found my voice. For a long time, I thought strength meant enduring everything in silence. I believed that questioning authority, especially within a family, made you ungrateful. That asking for clarity meant causing conflict. That protecting others' comfort was more important than protecting your own future. That dinner taught me how wrong I was. The truth didn't destroy my family. It exposed a system that depended on my silence to survive. I learned that financial control can be just as damaging as any visible harm. When information is hidden, choices are taken away. When fear replaces honesty, independence becomes an illusion. And when young people are told to be grateful instead of informed, they often blame themselves for struggles that were never theirs to carry. What changed everything wasn't anger. It was accountability. Once professionals were involved, once conversations were documented, once boundaries were clearly stated, the imbalance of power disappeared. Not because someone punished my parents, but because transparency replaced secrecy. That's something I wish more people understood. Seeking legal guidance isn't betrayal. It's protection. If there's one thing I hope others take from my story, it's this. You have the right to know the truth about your own life. You have the right to ask questions without being shamed. And you have the right to support, especially when that support was promised to you. Healing didn't mean everything went back to the way it was. It meant moving forward with clarity. It meant choosing peace over pretense. It meant building a future based on honesty, not obligation. Today, my life isn't perfect. But it's mine. I make decisions without fear. I ask for help without guilt, and I no longer confuse control with love. Sometimes, the most powerful moment in your life isn't when you fight back. It's when you finally say, "I deserve to know the truth. I deserve to know the truth." Because once the truth is spoken, it doesn't just change a conversation. It changes a life.